So this tutorial is going to show you how to get started with spatial audio using Reaper and using the IEM plugin suite. So the IEM plugin suite is a free and open source plugin suite that lets you work with ambisonic spatial audio formats. And it works really well with Reaper, but with any audio software that you might work with. So the first thing you have to do is just download the plugins, Mac, Windows, or Linux. And when you download it, it should just pop up with an installer or something like that and just install them into your default plugin location. So if you need to, you can sort of search for help with that. It's a very standard thing to do. And once you've downloaded and installed the plugins, in Reaper, most likely you're going to have to come up here, go to Settings, scroll down to the Plugins section, find the plugin format that you installed. So I installed only the VST plugin format. There's also an LV2 plugin format, which is just another format's just comparable. Or I think there's also standalone standalone IEM plugins that you can use. But I just installed the VST because that's what I typically use for this. So once you do that, you select here, and then you have to rescan your plugin folder. Probably when you open up Reaper, it'll do this automatically. But if you, this is always just a quick check just to make sure that Reaper can find the plugins. So if you're looking for the plugins, you don't find them, this is why. And once you've done that, you can go to your FX plugins suite. Look for the IEM. So normally I sort of scroll down to the manufacturer section here, or developer section, and find IEM and look for those. You can also search for them, but you have to know what the names of them are, and you might not know what the name of these plugins are yet, so it's nice to sort of see all the ones you just installed. A lot of really cool ones in here, right? I have not played around with many of these, so we're just going to deal with a couple of them today. So the first thing I'm going to do now is, I'm going to add the stereo encoder here. And then I'm going to come back here and I'm going to install the binaural decoder. Okay, so now notice what I'm doing here is I installed the stereo encoder on my track of my audio track, which is this track right here. I'll just solo it just for simplicity. And I put a binaural decoder on our master bus. So what we're doing here is this is encoding our stereo file into ambisonics format. This is decoding our stereo back to a format we can listen to. In this case, we're using headphones, and so I'm using a binaural decoder to create a binaural mix, which should create use all that spatial information using a head-related transfer function, so we can listen to it with just two speakers. So there's one other thing we need to do, which is actually super important. So ambisonics, when you go to ambisonics format, you actually use 16 audio channels to capture the spatial information in that ambisonics track. So what that means is that this track was a stereo track originally. You can see there's sort of two tracks right here. But when we added the encoder, we actually made this 16 tracks within just this one track here. And so what I need to do is go to our Route tab, come up here to where it says Track Channels, and by default it should be at 2. And we're going to have to set it to 16. When we do that, there's now going to be 16 level meters right here. And we're going to have to do the same thing for our master bus. Go to Route, and make sure you select 16 track channels for our master bus. Now when I do that and I hit play, notice that there are 16 level meters here, and there's actually only 2 level meters out here because we've decoded it back to stereo, right? All right. So once we've done that, our stereo track's been converted to ambisonics, and our ambisonic 16 track audio goes here and it's converted back to stereo. And now we can use our stereo encoder to move that sound around. Kind of fun just to play around so we get a sense for how things work. as you move around here. So basically a couple things going on here. This width is the stereo width. So notice when width is at 0, my left and right side of my stereo file are in the same position. If I increase this all the way, I can get to a wide image or even like a super wide image, right? So it's actually look at all that sort of manipulation that we can do. It just keeps rolling around, right? So if I come back here, then we can use azimuth just to rotate them around. And again, so we continuously go around. We can use elevation to move it above us or below us. And then we can do roll to again do another kind of rotation around us. So there's a lot of different options for how you can manipulate things. Generally speaking, azimuth is probably the one that's going to be the most obvious. But height and elevation or height can be a lot of fun as well. All right, so this is a nice, easy way of encoding something, a stereo track, into a spatial mix. This is also if you wanted to do some motion, probably what you would do is come in here and go to the automation track envelope section. Scroll down, and you're probably going to automate the azimuth. So that's this control right here. So if I come in here now and I draw in a curve like that, then you can automate that and create some pretty cool effects. Notice, by the way, that that was not effective, right? Because it takes time. First of all, something like this, which has a lot of short sounds, just doing these rapid pannings like this, it's like it doesn't really have the impact you might want to have. I find the thing that works the best here is actually do slower pans, so you can kind of hear. But it really depends on what you're looking for, and we'll talk more about that in class. Okay. So that is one way of doing spatial panning. Another way of doing it is to use the room encoder. And what this is going to do is it's going to let you define an XY position for your sound, and it's going to help also add some room sound to the spatial positions. This is a little bit like adding reverb, but it's a little bit more subtle than that, right? So if I start in here, and whoops, I haven't set this track to being 16 channels. Look how weird that is. I need to go here, go to routing, make sure I set to 16 track channels. And now I'm going to get more of the sound I expect to have. So the idea here is we have two things. We have a listener, which is this green dot, and we have a source, which is this orange dot. So you can see me panning it to the left, to the right, ahead of us, behind us. You kind of feel that depth. I can hear this a little bit better in this mix. You can also do above us or below us. Notice the amplitude gets a lot louder as it gets closer to us, right? So what we're hearing here, what we see here are all of the reflections that are being generated. If you want more information about how these plugins actually work and what all of the different plugins are, you can go to the IMM website, go to documentation, and there's descriptions of all of the plugins here. And they will tell you what all of the controls do and how you can utilize it. There's not necessarily, this is an open source and a free project, so it might not be as straightforward as you might think. You can probably just Google and sort of look around for other people describing and talking about this stuff as well to help it make more sense. Anyways, once you have added some spatial routing to all of your tracks, I'm going to go ahead and throw in another stereo encoder on this last track. Let's go ahead and make it be a little bit wide. Come here. And I'm going to listen to all my tracks. Better make sure this is 16 tracks. And now, once I've got everything encoded, I can go to render my track. And I can just render this as a stereo track because what we're doing is we are ultimately decoding back to stereo. Now you could ask yourself, what if you wanted to have more than two outputs? What if you wanted to encode it to 4 to quad, for example? Then you can add a decoder like this, and you can choose the layout of your loudspeakers. So once we've got our spatial audio stuff installed, the next question arises is what might you do when you're mixing with spatial audio? Like what are effective techniques? Like how do people use this stuff? And there's probably lots of ways of doing this. The three ways that I kind of have run into is the first is using all of the additional spatial locations to be able to add more sounds and sort of more content to your tracks, but give them all their own space so they can coexist together. When you play two sounds at the same spatial location, then their frequency spectrums just really can interfere with each other, conflict with each other, right? So, and then when you're dealing with a stereo mix and there are a lot of sounds happening in the middle, you really have to think about making sure that every sound has its own slice of the frequency spectrum. But when you pan things left and right, all of a sudden the left and the right sounds aren't competing with each other as much, and they can complement each other. And when you have spatial audio opportunities, then you have a lot of complementation. You can a lot of space to play sounds in a complementary way, where they're not going to compete with each other for the frequency spectrum as much, and so you can just get a lot more going on. That can be like really a fun way to sort of play around with sound. The second thing that you can do is you can try to take advantage of the characteristics of spatial audio in a kind of a creative and a mobile way. So things like using automation curves to make sounds rotate around you. This works really well with binaural audio because you can sort of make it sound like things are going behind you or above you, and those kinds of sensations are most apparent when things are moving, right? You can really tell when things change their position. That has a much more dramatic impact than something that's in a static position. So if you just put something static above you in an HRTF binaural decoder, that may or may not be apparent as being above you. But if you take something that's in front of you and move it above you, you'll hear it change. Then you're more likely to be able to perceive that as being something that's actually physically moving in that sort of three-directional sphere around your head. Obviously, binaural audio is not as effective. Remember, we're using a head-related transfer function that's not your head, right? Somebody else's head, and so you may not perceive that spatial location in the same way. So really, it's imperfect compared to actually using a recording studio with multiple speakers. The third thing that you can do is create kind of a hyper real spatialization. So this is like, going for a nature walk and making it sound, like there's squirrels behind you, or as you're walking down the trail, there's a bird chirping that's in front of you, and as you walk past it, it moves behind you. So those kinds of sort of recreating physical sensations is another thing that people often do. So we do this in stereo as well. Like when you're recording a pianist, you'll oftentimes record them in stereo and make it so that the left side of the piano, the lower strings come from the left, the higher strings come from the right. This is the pianist's perspective. When the pianist plays with the left hand, they're playing the lower notes. When they're playing with the right hand, they're playing the higher notes. And so the pianist, if you play a piano scale going up the keyboard, you'll actually hear it going from left to right. That's very common for piano recordings. Or for drum sets also, we generally tend to pan the drums from the perspective of the drummer, so the hi-hat might be a little bit to the left, the toms are going to go left, middle, right as you go high, mid, low. And that's a pretty typical way to do it. With spatial audio now, you could decide that you want to put the listener in the middle of the band. You want to be able to have the vocalist right in front of you, but the guitar player behind you, and the drums to your right, and the bass probably close to you too, because we like that big bass sound. But maybe there's a string section behind you to your right, and there's a horn section in front of you to your left. Think about how fun that can be to have this band sort of like all around you in space. So a lot of really fun things to play around with. Do use the binaural decoder. It's super effective. It's great. You can send people tracks and very easily they can experience as long as they're using headphones because binaural audio requires using headphones to get the effect. But do try to find a way to get access to at least a quad speaker system because it's really much more effective to do this with multiple speakers rather than binaural audio. It's just a very different thing. So it's really worth trying to source look for that if you're really interested.